So it's been brought to my attention that I left out a couple of games in my previous Resident Evil video. If you haven't watched that video, I recommend you do for context. It's right up there in the corner. Go ahead, I'll wait. So yeah, I left a few important games out because I mistakenly assumed they were inconsequential spin-offs, except for Resident Evil Village. I was just waiting for the DLC to come out to see if it changed my opinion of the game or not. With that said, let's dive in to the Resident Evil games I forgot, starting with
Resident Evil.
Alright, yes, I hear you about Code Veronica. Thank you for all the comments asking where this game is. So I left this one out of the first video because I hadn't played it yet, and I considered it a spin-off game, since it wasn't a main numbered entry. My bad. With the massive success of Resident Evil 2 in 1998, Capcom began development on multiple Resident Evil projects on multiple consoles. Resident Evil Code Veronica originally started out as an attempted Sega Saturn port of Resident Evil 2. Once it was made apparent that the port wasn't going to be able to happen without sacrificing graphical quality, Capcom asked producer Shinji Mikami and his team to make something else for Sega fans. So they started developing an original Sega Saturn game. Capcom demanded that the game have better technical quality, so development switched to the upcoming Dreamcast. Around the same time, a side story game for the PlayStation starring Jill Valentine and the events leading up to Resident Evil 2 was being developed. This was originally intended to be a spin-off, with the Dreamcast game as the true sequel. The side story was branded as Resident Evil 3, and the true sequel was labeled a spin-off and titled Code Veronica. The story of the game follows Claire Redfield trying to escape Rockford Island, an Umbrella facility on a remote island in the Antarctic Ocean, while also looking for her brother Chris. Along the way, she meets Steve Burnside, and the two work together, and while exploring, they have to fight the commander of the island, Alfred Ashford, who is mentally unstable and cross-dresses as his twin sister.
Alfred! You cross-dressing freak!
Anyway, the gameplay is standard Resident Evil fare: fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited supplies, and inventory space. The game introduces a lot of unique enemies though, like the Bandersnatch, a weird stretchy-armed monster that was created as a cheaper alternative to the Tyrant, since they're expensive and only a select few people are genetically capable of becoming a Tyrant. There's also Nosferatu, the mutated father of the Ashford twins after they experimented on him with the T. Veronica virus and locked him in the basement. The game also has its own tyrant, the T-78, a tyrant with blunt hands with spikes sticking out like fleshy maces. It was apparently used for combat training for Umbrella soldiers. The reason this game is considered more than a spin-off is the fact that it reintroduces series villain Albert Wesker, which marked his first appearance since his supposed death in the first game. The story is a little goofy and convoluted, but that's what makes Resident Evil fun. Two twins who were grown in test tubes take over a facility and create the T. Veronica virus by mixing the T virus with the virus found in ants, and Alexia Ashford infects herself and freezes herself. It's goofy and crazy, but fun. Overall, the game was met with massive acclaim upon its February 2000 release, and it even outsold Shenmue. With 450,000 units sold in the US alone, it wasn't the best-selling game on the series, but it was the best-selling Dreamcast game. The PS2 version, titled Code Veronica X, released in 2006 and actually outsold Resident Evil 4 by July of 2006. That's a bit crazy, but on to the next game.
Resident Evil 0.
While the original Resident Evil was still in development, the idea for a prequel was brought up following the 1995 announcement of the 64DD, a magnetic floppy disk drive accessory for the N64. Unfortunately, the 64DD flopped, and Capcom decided to move development back to a cartridge-based N64 game. The development on the N64 version started in 1998 and was one of many Resident Evil games being developed at the time. Led by director Koji Oda and producer Tatsuya Minami, the team approached with different ideas for gameplay and visual design that would function better with less storage, since an N64 cartridge is only capable of holding 64 megabytes of data. Resident Evil 0 was designed to be more difficult than its predecessors. The first step to increasing difficulty was removing the item boxes from the previous games to make the game more like Sweet Home, the progenitor of the series. You get it? The partner zapping system was designed to take advantage of the N64's lack of load times, which are mandatory for disc-based consoles like the PlayStation. In order to make one-on-one fights with zombies more intense, they experimented with making the zombies faster, similar to the Crimson Heads from the Resident Evil 1 remake. The prototype also supported local cooperative play. The game was announced at about 20% completion in January of 2000, with a playable demo available at Tokyo Game Show. The game was expected to release later that same year in July, and reportedly had an atmosphere close to the first Resident Evil. However, development began to slow down when it became apparent that the data for Resident Evil 0 wasn't going to fit on a single cartridge. So, the production shifted to the newly announced GameCube in September of 2000. More CGI cutscenes were made to make use of the new space, and the voice acting was re-recorded. The plot of the game follows STAR's Bravo team member Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, an ex-Marine who was to be executed for killing 23 people. The two explore another Umbrella Mansion laboratory in the Arklay Mountains. Weird that it happened twice, but okay. The two encounter all kinds of enemies while trying to survive, but the biggest enemy has to be the Leechmen, zombies made from infected leeches. The game really nails the atmosphere, and the enemy design is on point too. Like at one point you fight a proto-tyrant, a malformed early model tyrant that gets loose. The partner system is cool, but can be a bit annoying when playing solo because you'll be constantly dropping items and swapping over so the other can pick it up. Like a way more clunky version of Resident Evil 5's inventory. To be completely honest, you can skip this game and not miss out on much. It doesn't add anything to the story of the overall franchise other than giving some backstory to James Marcus, one of the co-founders of Umbrella. Literally nothing else in this game matters. In fact, Billy never shows up in any other game after this, and Rebecca just goes to the RE1 mansion and never mentions any of this. It's a prequel in the sense that it's called Resident Evil 0, and that's it. But, despite those complaints, the game does nail the Resident Evil atmosphere. Fixed camera angles and narrow corridors are classic Resident Evil, and this was the first of many games where Capcom kept trying to bring the series back to its roots. I guess it somewhat succeeded since the game sold 1.25 million copies on the GameCube, and the HD remaster has sold 2.8 million to date. But what about the Redfield bloodline, I hear you asking? Well, that was expounded upon in
Resident Evil Revelations.
Revelations was directed by Koshi Nakanishi, who worked as a game designer for Resident Evil 5 and developed exclusively for the Nintendo 3DS. Why the 3DS? Well, the team thought that the 3DS's, 3D capabilities would produce a tense and scary experience with a realistic and immersive atmosphere, giving players a feeling that something could be lurking around every corner. The most interesting thing about the game to me is that the team decided to give the game an episodic structure with short and varied chapters to make the game better suited for a handheld game console. The main goal of the development team was to bring Resident Evil back to its roots, yep, there's that sentence again, while at the same time modernizing its gameplay. Sounds like an oxymoron to me, but let's see if they managed to do it. A cruise ship was chosen as the main setting for the game because of its opportunity to provide claustrophobic corridors and make the player feel helpless in the middle of the ocean. Which I think was a great choice because it was different and hadn't been done before. Okay, hadn't been done in 3D before. The sound design is on point. There were plenty of times where I got spooked by random sounds in the distance. And unlike previous Resident Evil games, the developers designed Revelations so that the player could move and shoot at the same time. Now, that may not sound like much nowadays since all modern Resident Evil games let you move and shoot, but at this time, it was a first for the franchise. Producer Masachika Kawada explained that the reason it wasn't implemented in earlier games was because they believed it would make the game too fast for a survival horror game. The plot of the game revolves around a terrorist group known as Veltro that launched a bioterrorist attack against the city of Terra Grigia using BOWs. While investigating possible BOW activity near the ruins of the city, Joe Valentine and her partner Parker were informed that Chris and his partner Jessica went missing while following a lead on Veltro.
We lost contact with Chris and Jessica.
When? How?
We're not certain. I've sent their last known coordinates to your terminals.
The signal was lost over the ocean.
Which turns out to be the Queen Zenobia, an abandoned cruise ship. Long story short, it was a trap by Veltro. Chris and his partner were actually still in the mountains, and they headed to the ship to save Jill and Parker. Veltro plans to infect the ocean with the T-Abyss virus, which is the T-virus crossed with a bacteria found in deep-sea life. There's also some corrupt government officials, which is nothing new for Resident Evil. Revelations released in 2012 and was among the top 25 selling games, selling 122,000 units, which was considered successful for a 3DS game. But Capcom wanted it to sell more given the large development cost. The HD version is what I played, and I gotta say, it definitely looks like a 3DS game. The textures look stretched and pixelated, but at least the characters look decent. But despite the hiccups, it was successful enough to warrant a sequel.
Resident Evil.
Capcom announced that the team responsible for Revelations would be responsible for the sequel, and a playable version of the game would be seen at Capcom's 2014 Tokyo Game Show booth. It was revealed early on that not only would Chris and Jill not be a part of Revelations 2, but the game would also not be directly tied to the first Revelations. The plan was to have Revelations be its own side series used to fill in the gaps and plot holes between the main entries and expand the lore of the universe. Yudai Yamaguchi was chosen as cutscene director for his mix of horror and goofy gore. The story is once again split into episodes, but is a bit more complicated this time. It's divided into two scenarios: the past scenario with Claire Redfield and Moira Burton, and the present scenario with Barry Burton. Claire Redfield and Moira Burton, daughter of Barry Burton, work for biohazard prevention agency TerraSave. While attending an office party, they and several other TerraSave members are captured by armed mercenaries. Claire and Moira are taken to a facility on Sejam Island, where they are attacked by the Afflicted, mutated humans driven insane by torturous experiments. An unknown woman calling herself the Overseer watches via cameras and tells them the bracelets on their wrists record fear as the pair try to find safety. The Overseer turns out to be Alex Wesker, who wants to escape death by copying her consciousness into a little girl named Natalia. Yup, that's deadass her plan. The virus this time around is the T-Phobos virus, a virus that responds to fear, transforming the host into a monster. The Ouroboros virus from Resident Evil 5 also gets released on the island, creating even weirder monsters. Claire and Moira's goal is to stop Alex Wesker and save Natalia and escape the island, while Barry's goal in the future is to save Moira and Natalia and kill She-Wesker. The gameplay is on par with the first game. The gunplay is nice and the monster designs are crazy and gory, and I love it, like Durga, the Revenants, and the Rotten, to name a few. Revelations 2 does a good job filling in the gaps between Resident Evil 5 and 6, but the best thing this game does is bringing back Barry Burton, baby, Mr. Jill Sandwich himself. The T-Phobos virus is also a really interesting concept that I wish was brought back in a future game. But all in all, the game sold really well, and as of 2020, the original release of the game sold 2.6 million units. Probably the game most people point to as a diamond in the rough during this time in the franchise. And now, to tie up one final loose end with the latest installment in the franchise that I excluded because I was waiting for the DLC to drop to see if it would change how I felt about the game. Spoilers ahead if you haven't played the game yet, for some reason. Resident Evil Village was in development for about 3.5 years before its announcement in 2020. Capcom asked the Resident Evil team to start development on August 6th of 2016, about 6 months before Resident Evil 7 released. During this early period, they came up with the concept of the village as the central theme, inspired by Resident Evil 4. Director Morisama Sato wanted the game to feel like a playable horror movie. Resident Evil Village is set 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7. Ethan Winters returns as the protagonist, having defeated bioweapon Evelyn in Resident Evil 7. Ethan has been living with his wife, Mia, and 6-month-old daughter, Rosemary, when Chris Redfield and his men suddenly appear, murder his wife in cold blood, and kidnap him and his baby daughter, bringing them to a mysterious European village. Ethan has to traverse the village to rescue Rosemary. The village is invaded by werewolf-like mutants called Lycans and governed by 4 different mutant lords, each controlling their own forces from strongholds within the village. There's Lady Alcina Dimitrescu, an unusually tall vampiric aristocrat who resides at Castle Dimitrescu with her 3 daughters, Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela, and mutated female attendants. The hallucination-inducing and ghost-like Donna Beneviento rules from her mansion, House Beneviento, and acts through her puppet Angie. The grotesque Salvatore Moreau operates from a reservoir in close proximity to the village and is described as a merman. Carl Heisenberg, my boy, who can manipulate electromagnetic fields, leads a group of Soldat simulacra from a contemporary factory. All houses respond to a supreme leader figure called Mother Miranda, the witch-like ruler of the village who is a presence worshipped by the villagers. Gameplay is still pretty tight with the model from RE7 and retains the first-person perspective, at least it did until they added a third-person option with the recent DLC. The gunplay is great, and the villains this time around are campy horror movie archetypes come to life, and I love it. Heisenberg is my favorite by far, with Lady Dimitrescu as a close second, because holy shit was she plastered over all the marketing for the game, because Capcom knew what they were doing when designing that character. Vampire Mommy aside, the story is kinda meh, but I guess it's worth mentioning that Miranda actually taught Oswald Spencer about the Megamycete, which led him down his path to forming Umbrella and discovering the progenitor virus. Speaking of Miranda, her motivations are pretty dumb in my opinion. She kidnaps Rose to use her to resurrect her dead daughter who died to the Spanish flu or something, I don't know. The enemies this time around are thankfully more diverse than Resident Evil 7. Instead of generic mold monsters, we get lichens, blood-drained husk, cyborg zombies, no I'm not joking, creepy killer dolls, and giants. The castle is fun because, mommy, the Beneviento house is by far the scariest section because you have no weapons and there are creepy sounds and atmosphere and a weird fetus monster. Moreau is actually kind of boring, he just tries to eat you the whole time while you try to drain his reservoir. Heisenberg's factory is my favorite part of the game. Trying to escape his factory while fighting his soldats, topping off with a fight against Propellerhead. I know its name is Stern, but Propellerhead sounds funnier to me. And an even crazier fight with Heisenberg where you drive a fucking tank for the first half. It's goofy fun, and I enjoyed it very much. The DLC Shadows of Rose is also a fun experience as well, but doesn't really add anything notable story-wise. Overall, Resident Evil Village is a great step up from Resident Evil 7. In fact, it sold 3 million copies within the first 3 days. And I honestly can't wait to see where the series goes next. So, there are the games I left out of the previous video. I tacked on Resident Evil 0 because it's technically a main entry. And by the way, the support on that video is amazing. The community is growing and I couldn't be happier about that, so thank you. I do have plans to do one more Resident Evil video, so stay tuned. I'm the Wildcard, and as always, I'll see you next time.